Right now, at this very second, there's more pressure pressing down on the Mariana Trench than the weight of 50 jumbo jets stacked on top of your thumbnail. And humans have been there, not in theory, not in simulation, actually there, flesh and metal, descending into a darkness so complete that your brain would struggle to process it even if you had light. But here's what they don't tell you in documentaries. Most of these dives almost killed everyone involved. Equipment imploded, windows cracked under impossible forces, communication died, and in some cases, the people inside had absolutely no idea if they'd ever see the surface again. What you're about to hear isn't a list of achievements, it's a countdown of survival stories, where the margin between triumph and catastrophic death was sometimes less than an inch of titanium. These aren't just the deepest dives, they're the moments when humanity pressed against the absolute physical limits of what our planet allows, and the ocean pushed back harder than anyone expected. Let's start with something you need to understand before we go deeper. The ocean doesn't compress you the way you think it does. Everyone imagines getting crushed like a soda can, but that's not quite accurate. Your body is mostly water, and water doesn't compress much. The real problem? The air spaces. Your lungs, your sinuses, any tiny pocket of gas in your body wants to collapse into itself. At 24,000 feet, we're talking about pressures exceeding 10,000 pounds per square inch. That's not a metaphor, that's the actual weight trying to find its way into every weakness. But here's where it gets interesting. In 1934, decades before we had the technology to handle these depths properly, two men named William Beebe and Otis Barton did something absolutely insane. They welded themselves into a steel ball called a bathysphere, attached it to a cable, and asked a ship to lower them 3,028 feet down. No propulsion, no maneuverability, just a metal ball on a string dangling in the abyss. And during one descent, they heard it. A metallic groan that made both men freeze. Something was bending. Was it the cable? The sphere? The window that was their only view into the deep? They had no way to know and no way to get out fast. They could only signal the surface to pull them up and hope the groan wasn't the last sound before implosion. They made it, but that sound haunted deep-sea diving for decades because it revealed something crucial. We were building these vessels blind. We didn't actually know where the breaking point was until we got dangerously close to it. Now let's jump forward to 1960, because this is where the story gets genuinely unbelievable. Two men, Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh, climbed into a submarine called the Deadliest with one mission: reach the deepest point on Earth, the Challenger Deep, nearly 36,000 feet down. They weren't sure the vessel would survive. In fact, they were almost certain something would go wrong because the mathematics of pressure at that depth were so extreme that engineers could only estimate. And something did go wrong. At around 30,000 feet, 5 miles under the surface, they heard a crack that shook the entire vessel. Sharp, definitive, the kind of sound that means structural failure. In the pitch darkness of the descent, with no possibility of rescue, they had to make a choice. Abort and possibly never know if humans could reach the bottom, or continue and risk becoming a permanent part of the seafloor. They kept going. Here's what they didn't know until they surfaced hours later. An outer window had cracked. Not the main pressure sphere, thankfully, but close enough that they had been riding a knife's edge between data collection and disaster. When they finally touched down on the bottom, spending just 20 minutes there before ascending, they had achieved something profound. But the cost was psychological. Walsh later described the descent as hours of controlled terror. Not fear, terror. The kind that comes from knowing that every second the ocean is testing every weld, every seal, every calculation you made on the surface. But wait, if humans reached the deepest point in 1960, why did it take 52 years for anyone to go back? This is the question that reveals just how dangerous these dives actually are. The Trieste dive was so risky, so expensive, and so technically marginal that no one wanted to repeat it. Think about that. We went to the moon 9 times in the decade after the Trieste dive, but we didn't return to the Challenger Deep. Why? Because at least in space, if something goes wrong, there's a chance of rescue. At the bottom of the Mariana Trench, there is no rescue. There is no backup plan. You are more isolated than an astronaut because at least astronauts can communicate clearly with Earth. At extreme ocean depths, even sound gets weird. Enter James Cameron, 2012. Yes, that James Cameron. The filmmaker became obsessed with designing a submarine that could reach Challenger Deep safely. Not just survive it, but film it, collect samples, spend time there. He called it Deep Sea Challenger, and it was a radical design, a vertical torpedo shape that descended quickly to minimize time in the danger zone. But here's what almost nobody talks about. During the dive, his communication system failed completely. For over an hour at the bottom of the ocean, he was utterly alone with his thoughts, his cameras, and the creaking sounds of his submarine adjusting to pressures that would crush a human instantly. Cameron described seeing something down there that he wasn't prepared for. Nothing. Vast, empty, nothing. The psychological weight of being in the most remote place on Earth with no one to talk to, surrounded by darkness so complete that even his lights couldn't penetrate far. He cut his planned 6-hour bottom time to less than 3 hours, not because of technical problems, but because the isolation was crushing him mentally. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. After Cameron's dive, you'd think we'd have regular deep-sea exploration, right? Wrong. Deep Sea Challenger was damaged during transport after the mission and never dove again. Once more, the deepest point on Earth became unreachable. The pattern was repeating: incredible risk, singular achievement, then silence. Until Victor Vescovo changed everything in 2019, but not in the way you'd expect. Vescovo wasn't a scientist or a filmmaker. He was a private equity investor who had climbed the 7 highest mountains and wanted a new challenge. So he commissioned a submarine called DSV Limiting Factor. And he didn't just want to visit Challenger Deep once, he wanted to go multiple times, and he wanted to bring passengers. On his 4th dive to the bottom, something happened that revealed just how much we still don't understand about these depths. The submarine's external cameras caught footage of a plastic bag sitting on the seafloor at 35,853 feet. Think about that. Humans had only been to this spot a handful of times, but our plastic waste had beaten us there. The discovery was simultaneously depressing and revealing. If plastic can reach the bottom, what else is down there that we can't see? But here's the technical marvel. Vescovo's sub used a pressure hull made of titanium so precisely manufactured that it could withstand repeated dives. Every previous deep-sea vessel was essentially a one-shot deal. Limiting Factor proved that with enough engineering and resources, these dives could be repeatable. He's since completed over 20 dives below 10,000 meters, more than all of humanity before him combined. Now let's talk about what happens when things go wrong, because that's where the real story lives. In 2020, during a dive to a depth of around 24,000 feet in the Puerto Rico Trench, a different research submarine experienced what's called a battery failure cascade. The lights died, then the propulsion, then, critically, the ballast system that allows the sub to surface.
The crew was stuck in darkness, sinking slowly, with about 4 hours of life support remaining. Here's the nightmare scenario. At those depths, you can't just blow emergency ballast and shoot to the surface. The pressure differential is so extreme that a rapid ascent would cause the bends, potentially killing everyone inside, even if the submarine held together. They had to troubleshoot in darkness, using only emergency chemical lights, trying to restore power to a system that was never designed to be repaired underwater. They did it. With 30 minutes of oxygen remaining, they got partial power restored and began a controlled ascent that took nearly 6 hours. When they surfaced, the lead engineer said something that perfectly captures deep-sea diving. We train for failures, but we don't train for cascade failures in the dark at depth. You can't simulate the psychological pressure of knowing that every second you don't solve the problem, you're using oxygen you can't replace.
But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of these deep dives isn't the pressure or the darkness, it's the sound. Multiple divers have reported the same phenomenon. At extreme depths, you can hear the submarine adjusting, constant creaking, groaning, small pops as materials compress microscopically. Your brain interprets every sound as potential failure, and there's no way to turn it off. You're trapped in a metal tube, listening to it complain about the forces trying to destroy it for hours. Dr. Catherine Sullivan, who became the first woman to reach Challenger Deep in 2020, described it as being inside a living thing. The submarine breathes, she said. It contracts and expands. It makes sounds that seem biological. And your primitive brain, the part that kept your ancestors alive on the African savanna, is screaming at you that you're in danger, even though intellectually you know the submarine is designed for this. This psychological element is why deep-sea diving programs now include extensive mental training. It's not enough to be brave. You have to be able to override millions of years of evolution telling you that you're about to die. Some of the most physically courageous people wash out of deep-sea programs because they can't handle the sensory experience of being that deep.
So where does this leave us? Right now, in 2024, fewer people have been to the deepest parts of the ocean than have walked on the moon. 12 humans have walked on the lunar surface. Only about 24 have been to Challenger Deep or similar extreme depths. And the gap isn't closing as fast as you'd think. Why? Cost is part of it. A single deep-sea dive can cost upward of $1 million when you factor in the submarine, support ship, crew, and equipment. But the bigger issue is that unlike space exploration, which captured public imagination and government funding, the deep ocean feels less exotic. We know what's down there, right? Water, darkness, strange fish. Except we really don't know. Recent dives have discovered species we never knew existed, underwater mountains taller than Everest, and geological processes that are changing our understanding of planetary science. The deepest point on Earth remains more mysterious than Mars. We have better maps of Mars than we do of our own seafloor. And every time someone descends to these extreme depths, they come back changed, not just by what they saw, but by what they experienced. The pressure, the isolation, the vulnerability.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and subscribe for more.